Gentlemen, today is August 24th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Well, can't complain.
That's good.
Anything exciting happened this week?
I think it's pretty normal Dota grind. I got Divine 2, so that's another bracket up. It's been cool. I haven't had a bunch of raging degens on my team this weekend, though, but that happens.
Par for the course, huh?
Yeah, it's like poker. You get good cards, you get bad cards. And your success as a player means trying to succeed with your good cards as much as you can and try to avoid psychic damage with your bad cards as much as you can.
There you go.
So, hanging in there. But it's a cool climb, mainly playing Terrorblade. That's my most selected hero. And I had a hour-and-a-half game with the StarCraft lads yesterday, which was really epic. We ended up winning it. But we were up against the ropes for a long time, and it was such a different mental stance than most teams that I'm on have. One of our guys on the team, as we're defending our ancient, our last structure only, he said, this is a banger of a game. And most people would say, get me out of here. This is a hellish nightmare. Let them win so we can move on. So that was good. My other BG3 run with Chai has been going well. We're in Act 2, just about to try to help Halson with the portal. So that one's going along. We did a different approach to the Gauntlet of Shar, where instead of, those portals that spawn a bunch of Sharans, instead of trying to snipe the portals fast, we just let them spawn as many Sharans as possible to get more experience. And if you let them all spawn, the final one that spawns is like a gigantic Sharan warrior thing. I didn't even know that was a unit in the game.
Huh.
Yeah, so that was cool.
Interesting.
Definitely out of key points and everything by the end of that fight as a monk.
Yeah. And what about... Oh, you finished the other run, right?
Yeah, the other run was completed. Arcane Archer just slaps damage, so that was really fun. I think I did like 400 damage to the brain myself with Action Surge, Potion of Speed, Oil of Sharpness, and I think I had some other elixir. I can't remember if I did Viciousness or something else. But yeah, it's definitely a good class and subclass. I still get a kick out of reading the discussions in like the BG3 subreddit of like what you think the best class is. And someone was like, I think Paladin is the best because Smite hits really hard. It's like, well, you're actually wrong. It's Smoke Powder Barrel is the best class.
They are very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. I'm glad things continue to go well.
Mm-hmm. Just had some really nice Mexican food for dinner with family.
Oh.
There's a local place that's quite good. It's not a chain as far as I know. And they have really unique menu items. A lot of them are very authentically Mexican, and a lot of the staff is actually Mexican, so they know what they're doing.
There you go.
Good food.
That's what you want to see.
Always welcome.
What exactly did you have? Like a burrito or something? Enchiladas?
No, it was actually a sort of grilled octopus with sliced baked potato and mixed veggies with a sauce kind of thing over it. Pretty unique. My brother, yeah, my brother got a chicken burrito, which is kind of his go-to there. My mom got enchiladas, and then I'm the garbage disposal who finishes anything that people don't have. So,
I don't normally think of seafood when I think of Mexican food, but yeah, they do have a lot of coastline. I guess it would make sense that they would have some.
mm-hmm.
Oh, did you like it?
Yeah, it was very good. Very well cooked. A lot of times, octopus or squid can be too rubbery, but this was very well done.
Yeah, that's generally been my experience with octopus. That's kind of why I stopped seeking it out after a while. Just didn't really think it was to my taste.
Yeah, it is one of the more difficult things to cook, I think.
Well, how's things on the ranch?
They've been good. It's supposed to get cold tonight, so we took some of the things into the art studio just so they don't freeze, because some of the plants are kind of finicky about the temperature range that they'll tolerate. And we're nearing the end of the growing season. So trying to extend the lifespan of those plants as much as possible.
Gotcha. Well, was there anything in particular you wanted to get to today?
Yeah, there was one random thing not related to current news, but I had some like crazy loud techno going on my stream earlier today, and there was a Jamaican artist, like vocalist, that was sampled in it. It wasn't the main artist of the music, but there was an audio sample, and it had a very you probably aren't surprised by this, but it had an anti-police message to it, and someone got offended by this. And they were saying how hardworking police officers are and blah, blah, blah in the Western world. And I was thinking, well, Jamaica is in the West, but I don't know the state of Jamaican police. How is Jamaica doing? What's going on over there?
How is Jamaica doing? I can't remember the last time I read anything about Jamaica. So I don't know that I'm in a position to really judge. I don't think it's doing terribly.
That's good.
I think it would be in the news more if it were. It's certainly doing better than Haiti, but that's not that's not saying much. Yeah, I know back in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, they had some issues with police brutality.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of the decolonization movement was sort of at its peak at that time. And there was a lot of anti-establishmentarianism sort of in vogue in the political culture as well as the general culture at that time. But my impression is that the country had long since democratized.
Mm-hmm.
It's still relatively poor. It never really broke into the ranks of like developed countries or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not unusual for countries that have political economies that have their origins historically in plantations. Plantations are pretty toxic for any country's political economy. Like I don't know off the top of my head if I could name any country that has at one point had a strong plantation economy ever managing to really evolve into something resembling a modern economy. Like it's very difficult to do. The American South hasn't even really done that. Like a lot of the economic growth in the South has come from people in the North moving down, starting in the mid-20th century with the advent of air conditioning and with the construction of the interstate freeway system. So that's not really the same thing as like developing your own institutions and then enjoying endogenous economic growth. The South kind of imports economic growth from other regions and other countries. Texas is kind of an exception because we've had oil, so we can kind of cheat. Mm-hmm. Oil is kind of the God mode as far as state capacity goes, because that lets you kind of buy your way out of problems that other countries have to think their way through. And Texas has done relatively well in that regard in investing in institutions rather than just cheating, so to speak, by relying on oil revenue, although we kind of did have to learn the hard way. There definitely was a time when Texas was way, way too reliant on oil. But then the oil bust in the 80s happened, and there was a big swing to implement reforms in order to diversify the economy, and that's been pretty successful. So Texas is kind of the exception amongst Sun Belt states including in the South, or the South adjacent in the case of Texas. Florida is also kind of an exception because they've had massive immigration from Cuba and a whole shit ton of federal money. I believe the South in general enjoys a lot of federal money to varying degrees, but Florida in particular benefited from the space program, military bases, etc. So that gave them an edge. But even in, also, obviously, Florida itself has enjoyed shit tons of immigration from the northeastern United States. That's also been a major boost for them. But beyond that, like, I think Atlanta and the Research Triangle in North Carolina are pretty much the only parts of the Deep South that have managed to develop significantly economically. I know there's been more recently on the Gulf Coast, but a lot of that, I think, is like tourism, entertainment, stuff like that. I think there's some oil refinery capacity down there, but I think a lot of that is concentrated more in Houston than on the Gulf Coast and like Mississippi and Alabama. Virginia doesn't really count, because even back in the 19th century, Virginia and Maryland were sort of their own region. You probably remember that from the book, right? American Nations, that was sort of the Tidewater region.
Yeah.
Which was distinctive from the rest of the South because it was a little more aristocratic almost.
Yeah, they had a lot of gentrification.
Yeah, there's been a lot of people moving down from the north into that area too, which has kind of really changed the demography a lot. So the South, I don't think, is a counterexample to my point here. You know, plantations do not cultivate good institutions, either educational institutions or strong economic institutions like corporations, technology, innovation, etc. You kind of have to run against the grain in order to make it work. So the South has definitely benefited from being part of the overarching United States in that regard, because they've gotten a lot of investment and institutional support they would have not otherwise received. And if they had not received that, they would probably, even though they're sort of Anglo descent, have a lot more in common with Latin America than with the rest of the United States. So when I think of economies in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, I think of the fact that they're all originally, were anyway, founded as plantation economies, and then just kind of evolved into independent countries out of that over time. But as far as I know, all of them have struggled with the legacy of the plantation, you know, slavery, colonialism, etc. Like that's definitely left a mark and made it very hard for them to develop. I think Jamaica still leans on sugar exports, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to look it up, but I think that has long been one of their main exports. And I don't recall ever reading about any kind of major successful initiative to kind of boost Jamaica's economy into something other than a sort of developing Caribbean economy. I think they do produce a lot of, what is it, aluminum? Or is it bauxite, technically? For those who don't know, that you don't mine aluminum. That's not found naturally. You have to refine bauxite, which is found naturally, into aluminum. And I think, if I remember correctly, that Jamaica is one of the main sources for bauxite imports into the United States. So any aluminum product that you've ever consumed in the United States was quite possibly made from bauxite imported from Jamaica.
The island.
Yeah. But that's about it. That pretty much stretches what I remember about Jamaica. I can tell you more about the history of Jamaica, if that's of interest, but like the modern politics and economy. Couldn't tell you. They fly way under the radar. Pretty much all of the Caribbean does, unless you're talking like Cuba, Haiti, etc., maybe the Dominican Republic. That's sort of the big three of the Caribbean. You know, those make the news relatively more often because they're bigger. They've sent lots of migrants into the United States. But when you get into the lesser Antilles or Jamaica, some of the smaller island countries, you hardly ever hear about them. Maybe if you're not American, maybe if you're somebody who lives outside the United States and you're listening to this, you may assume that Americans are familiar with the Caribbean, or at least are peripherally familiar with most of the Caribbean because they're so close. Mm-hmm. But really, most Americans can only tell you like the big three: Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti. And even then, most Americans probably don't know all that much about them. They probably are barely even aware that there are other island countries in the Caribbean. It's actually a pretty good number. Let me think here. It's Jamaica, obviously, Antigua and Barbuda. That's one country, by the way. The full name of the country is Antigua and Barbuda. Barbados is independent. Let's see, St. Kitts and Nevis, which I'm probably mispronouncing. St. Lucia, Grenada, which I remember because the United States invaded Grenada back in the 1980s. St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dominica? Yeah, Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. And then there's Trinidad and Tobago, which is kind of sort of Caribbean. I mean, it's definitely Caribbean in terms of culture. But if you look at a map, you can see it's kind of, you would assume if you saw a map of northern South America that Trinidad and Tobago was just part of Venezuela, because it's actually just right next to it and it's almost connected to it by land. But technically it is an island, and for historical reasons, it ended up getting colonized by, the British, the French, etc. And so it did not end up becoming part of Venezuela. And as a result, it's generally kind of lobbed into the Lesser Antilles as part of that island chain, even though it's not really part of the chain, it's kind of its own thing. But it's an island country in the Caribbean, so it kind of, again, it just gets thrown in with the others.
One of the things,
go ahead.
Something that just came to mind, one of the things that was mentioned in the American Nations book was contrasting a lot of the continental U.S. or like colonies with the Caribbean colonies, and how the culture of the Caribbean colonies from the European vantage point was a lot more just extracting value as fast as possible rather than establishing long-term bases in commerce.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a bit more predatory than a lot of the colonies in the U.S. People were trying to make a forever home for themselves and try to design new systems of government, and it was a lot more based on just like long-term investments rather than short-term value extraction.
Yeah, that was the issue. The settlements in the northeastern United States were not that profitable. They started out as sort of these proprietary business ventures, and they didn't make a whole lot of money. And the people who went there were largely interested in kind of setting up a new community separate from sort of the corruption as they saw it of traditional Europe. So they were quite interested in investing in institutions like schools, government, etc. Northeastern Americans tended to be very, very literate, for example, and that was something that they passed on into future generations, and that they achieved specifically by investing in schools and educational institutions. By contrast, in the Caribbean, like you say, the people who came there were mostly just looking for money. They were adventurers, speculators, just merchants of fortune, so to speak. And it was very high risk, high reward. It was very, very common for sugar plantations to actually fail. They were immensely profitable when they succeeded, and you could be very wealthy. But what I didn't know for a long time is that it actually took about 10 years to go from initial investment in a sugar plantation to the plantation actually becoming profitable. So it was very much a long-term investment, and a lot of people failed. In fact, probably most of them did. But because it was so profitable, that still attracted a lot of investors. And so a lot of people tried. And when they succeeded, they didn't really give a shit about, building community or whatever. Again, they were just there for the money. And it was a lot of the plantation investor class in the Caribbean that actually ended up migrating into the American South, as you recall in the book. Not so much the Tidewater region. Again, that's Virginia, Maryland, etc. That was sort of a different stock. Those were more English settlers. But in places like the Carolinas, Georgia, the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, in those places, it was more Caribbean settlers. That was more where they got their colonial class from. And they kind of brought the Caribbean mindset with them, that they're there to kind of invest to make money, but not to invest in community. And the South struggled with that for a very long time, and really continues to do so. I think I've used this example before, but it used to be normal in the United States in the 19th century for individual states to have their own central banks. And they would use these central banks to invest in things like infrastructure, land development, etc., stuff like that. And generally, they would make money by lending money to people who wanted to buy land from the government. And if you look at the history of state-run central banks in the United States over the course of the 19th century, the ones in the North, specifically the Northeast and the Midwest, were generally well-run, profitable, and did not have issues with literally running out of money, like going bankrupt. But if you look at the ones in the South, very different story. Lots of issues with profitability, corruption, etc. Some of the big financial panics in the early 19th century kind of stemmed more from central bank failures in the South. They were disproportionately culpable in those. The South didn't even have free public education until after the Civil War. And even then, it was imposed on them by the North. That was one of the sort of, I don't know what you would call it, war booty almost. Normally, war booty is something you steal from the people that you conquer, but in the case of the North, they forced the Southerners to have free public education. It was one of the relatively more popular changes they imposed. Free public education they kept. Civil rights for everybody, not so much. They didn't like that. That had to wait for another century. So I'm sorry I can't answer the question about Jamaica in greater detail.
It's okay. It's kind of a random thing that I was curious about just because of the music lyric.
I can give you a fun fact about Jamaica. Jamaica was originally a Spanish colony. Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, all of the Caribbean, along with pretty much all of the Americas, was originally claimed by Spain.
Huh.
And while they didn't really settle most of it, just because it was so big, Jamaica actually was settled by the Spanish initially. And it started life as a Spanish colony. What happened is, I believe, the War of Spanish Succession. Which, was it the War of Spanish Succession? Maybe it was an earlier war. I don't quite remember. Somebody in chat will probably remember and correct me. Sometime in the late 1600s, I want to say, there was a war. Actually, yeah, it would have been earlier than Spanish Succession. It would have been like 1660s, 1670s. This would have been sort of in the golden age of piracy, basically. So there was a war between Spain and England. England won. And as part of the peace treaty, England was able to get the Spanish to give them Jamaica. And that was a big coup. That was a big deal at the time. And the reason is that Jamaica was right astride sort of the main transportation route connecting Spain to some of its wealthiest colonies, specifically New Spain, or Mexico, as it's known now. There had been piracy for a long time in the Caribbean, but generally French, British, etc. pirates had to operate from more peripheral islands that were pretty small. And they were not the best bases of operations. You know, they could do it, but logistics were limited, kind of limited their capacity. But when the English got Jamaica, not only did they have a much bigger territory to operate from, which gave them a big logistical advantage, the colony itself was worth a lot, just because there was a lot of sugar plantations there. And so the pirates were able to get a lot of money. The English government was able to get a lot of tax revenue. And of course, again, sitting right astride the main transportation routes into Mexico, put Spanish fleets, specifically galleons, treasure fleets, etc., under much more danger than they had been, to say nothing of the Mexican coast itself, which had long been raided by sort of Western European pirates of one kind or another. And English pirates had much faster, easier access to that coast after Jamaica was taken. So losing Jamaica was considered a disaster by the Spanish. That was a strategic blow for them in the region. And the English, correspondingly, were delighted to be able to get it and made quick use of it. Now, the age of piracy didn't really last for more than a couple more decades after that. So the utility kind of declined over time as relations between Spain and England normalized. After that, Jamaica kind of became a backwater. It was known more for smuggling and whatnot, because the Spanish tried to impose a regime where the goods that were taken and sold into their colonies were supposed to be mostly Spanish. Or if they were not, the Spanish government would sell a license that was expensive, and they could make money that way. But the English, among other traders in Europe, would very frequently ignore that rule and just smuggle shit directly into Mexico and other Spanish colonies and just circumvent the Spanish crown entirely, which the Spanish government didn't like, but they also couldn't really do much about it because people in the colonies wanted cheaper stuff. And also the administrative capacity of the Spanish government, as well as the colonial governments working under them in the New World, were just not nearly strong enough to stop broad-based smuggling. The size of the territories involved was just immense. It's still immense even today. And so they just couldn't stop the smuggling, and it just kind of continued. So even after the age of piracy declined, smuggling was very common. Lots of English merchants made a lot of money off of that, especially in sort of North America. I think French merchants were more common in South America. I've read that French smuggling operations were quite common in Brazil and Argentina, I believe, and as well as maybe in the west coast of South America. I think I've heard that too, sort of in Chile and Peru. Yeah, after that, Jamaica just became much less important, sort of in the 1700s, 1800s. I think the drama in the 1800s is that slavery was banned, and so that created some waves.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit similar to learning about Hawaii and how Hawaii had a lot of sugarcane and sugar plantations, and as soon as there were laws about needing to pay workers a certain amount, then that whole industry collapsed there, because sugarcane is, I think, relatively difficult to harvest and make profitable if you're paying people normal wages.
Yeah, same issue. The economy declined as the plantation model declined. And I think it wasn't really until maybe the early mid-20th century when tourism started to take off. Did you know the first James Bond movie was set in Jamaica?
I did not.
I believe that's correct.
Sean Connery.
Sean Connery, Dr. No. Let me fact check myself to make sure I'm not making shit up. I think it was Jamaica. Yeah, it was Jamaica. Yeah, after that, there was a nationalist movement to get Jamaica independence in the mid-late 20th century, which succeeded, I believe, in the 60s, I want to say. Jamaica independence was like the late 60s. 62. Okay, early 60s, my mistake. But even after that, it was pretty common for the local whites to dominate the politics, and that created some tension. And I think that's sort of where reggae and some of the other religious and artistic movements that Jamaica is more famous for kind of originated.
Well, you mentioned diversifying the Texan economy beyond oil, and that made me think of how you said that Saudi Arabia is trying to do that. Is there anything that's kind of applicable that what Texas did for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a decent model, but I think the disadvantage the Saudis have is that they're kind of starting from scratch. Because even when Texas was still overly reliant on oil to drive their economy, they had been investing in institutions. So, for example, the University of Texas at Austin, that became one of the biggest universities in the country, kind of on the back of investment by the Texas state government, which was paid for decades largely through oil money. And that, of course, itself, just in and of itself, significantly contributed to diversification of the economy. Also, federal money helped a lot because federal investment and support for the development of microchips and semiconductors in the mid-20th century sort of fed the early growth of firms like Texas Instruments, which started out in North Texas, I believe it in around Dallas. So some of that is difficult to replicate, right? The Saudis don't really have the advantage of decades of foresight where they were already investing in educational institutions that could form the basis for a new diversification push. I think the Saudis do have some educational institutions, but they're not like world class. They're going to have to kind of build that up over time, and it's just an inherently slow process. I don't think it's something you can kind of snap your fingers and then just create with gobs of money. And of course, there's no federal government, in the Middle East that can kind of just give the money or support a given industry that can then help diversify the local economy. The Saudi government is on its own in that regard. So they can't necessarily learn from that, short of a time machine. But other things there's other things they can do. They can deregulate, they can lower taxes, they can try to make themselves more business friendly, basically. Some of it is cultural. Texas kind of inherently attracts people of a conservative American mindset, so it's easy to get in migration. If you want more human capital, well, maybe not human capital per se, if you want more labor, be it sort of wage labor or white collar labor, you can get that in Texas. We can attract that here because people of a given mindset are inherently attracted to sort of the overarching political, cultural environment. The Saudis kind of have a problem there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's not a whole lot of people that just really want to move to Saudi Arabia to work, especially if they're not Arab or not Muslim. So that makes it relatively difficult for them to kind of attract the labor that they would need in order to power new industries that could diversify the economy. So, that's another area where maybe they can't quite replicate Texas. But in terms of public policy, where they're just making the business environment more business friendly, reducing the tax burden, et cetera, that's all doable. I mean, the Emirates have already done that, right? Dubai, the UAE, et cetera, like they've been very successful at that model. In fact, I think we talked at length about the Emiratis, a couple weeks ago, and how successful they've been. The Saudis really ought to look at them probably more than Texas. That's a more relevant example of diversification and economic development. Although you could argue that the UAE never had to diversify away from something. They were not diversifying away from an oil-dependent economy, per se. They just didn't really have much of an economy to begin with, and they were trying to evolve it into something, which they did successfully. So that's a slightly different problem. than taking an existing setup and trying to adjust it. You can ask the Russians about that. Trying to transition from a centrally planned economy to a free market economy was quite wrenching and difficult. So, diversifying away from an oil-dependent economy is much easier than that. It's kind of a different ballpark, but that is harder than just starting from nothing and trying to build into something. Because if you're starting with nothing, then you have a clean slate. You don't have to account for established lobbyists or interest groups that maybe don't want the change or want the change to happen in a way that's favorable or don't actually care about the change because they've already got their money. Everybody kind of has an interest in economic development when you're starting with no economic development. But if you are starting from an elevated position where you do have a lot of money and you're trying to create something new, that can make waves that upset established interests, and that can create institutional resistance that's difficult to overcome. And that's sort of what the Saudis are trying to do. Even in the case of Texas, there was a lot of resistance to a long time. It wasn't really seen as diversifying the economy was not seen as necessary for a long time until everything went to shit. And then that kind of overcame organically the resistance to diversification, and reforms were able to go through. But the wiser thing would have been to do it much earlier. We just didn't really do that.
It's making me think of the cultural difference in Texas has a friendly, welcoming attitude. As long as you kind of live and let live, it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, because Texas is inherently multicultural from the start. Like, there was a pretty major mixture between European descent people and like native Mexican people in Texas when it was made, and I think the name Texas means friends.
Yep, Tejas.
Yeah, so just kind of that compared with a country that's a bit notorious for being very hardline with one particular religion, one particular way of being. It's not as favorable to kind of pick up your family from a different country and then move there unless you're already in that demographic. When I got to college, actually, both universities that I spent time in Texas, the student body was very, very diverse compared to the high school student body, just because a lot of people, they want to give their kids the best higher education opportunity they can, and Texas has a bunch of really good universities, not just like UT Austin. UT Dallas is really good. University of North Texas is really good. Kind of depends on what program you're trying to get into, but yeah, really good schooling is a strong edge, because then you're getting smart people who are specialized and who are innovating new technologies, which is increasing the chances that you're gonna like make a breakthrough or like create a new burgeoning industry.
Yeah, the Saudis are going to try, but it's not clear whether or not they'll succeed. We shall see. But I would much rather start with an oil-dependent economy than a plantation economy.
Yeah.
That's so much worse. Yeah, with a plantation economy, you just have a large portion of the population, probably the clear-cut majority of the population, that are just stuck working on the plantation, right? Mm-hmm. They're picking the cotton, they're harvesting the sugar cane, and the owner of the plantation has every incentive to keep them there. So that creates a big disincentive to trying to develop things, because if the economy gets good and there's other opportunities, then who the fuck would want to stay on the plantation?
Mm-hmm.
People would leave. And so the result is that there's just kind of a baked-in preference in plantation economies to keep things the same. Yeah, there's also a bunch of territories in the Caribbean. That is to say, sort of places that would be countries if they were independent, but they're still part of this, that, or the other country. The United States, a European country, maybe France or Britain, etc. There's a good number of those. Puerto Rico is probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous, in that category. That's part of the U.S. But then there's also, Guadeloupe, which is a French territory. Martinique, the other big French territory. And there's a whole gaggle of little ones. Again, Guela is one. That's a British territory. Montserrat, another British island. The Cayman Islands, another obvious case. Cayman Islands are a famous tax haven. That's been a sort of haven for all manner of dirty money for many decades now, probably since the mid-late 20th century. Interestingly, the Cayman Islands are not actually in the Lesser Antilles. They're kind of off on their own, which I always thought was weird. There's actually one island called Saba, which is split in half. So one half is a Dutch territory and the other half is a French territory. Yeah, and it's a tiny island, so there's hardly anything there, but just somehow it ended up getting split rather than just being absorbed whole into one or the other European empire. Yeah, I think there's also St. Eustatius and Martin. I think those are the Dutch islands. And then there's one other French island that's really tiny. The name escapes me. I'd have to look it up. Oh, and there's the Virgin Islands. You know, the British have their own Virgin Islands.
Did not know that.
Right next to the US Virgin Islands. It's all sort of the same, roughly, island group. And the US Virgin Islands used to belong to Denmark, but the United States government bought them from Denmark in like 1910, something like that. I think it was one of the last major territorial purchases. Actually, no, I think it was the last territorial purchase the United States made. I think that's about all of them. There's probably something really obvious I'm forgetting, though. There usually is. Yeah. Oh, the Bahamas. Of course. I always kind of forget about them. They're sort of in their own little area, north of either the Greater or Lesser Antilles. Now, that was originally just a pirate haven. There just really wasn't much else going on there.
With all this, you're saying the Pirates of the Caribbean was a documentary?
Maybe not a documentary per se, but yeah, it is based on an actual period of history, the golden age of piracy in the late 17th century. Yeah, there was a kind of handshake agreement that ended that era, because the British government had been sponsoring the piracy. It wasn't just individual pirates kind of pirating on their own. They were actually getting money from the British government to do that in exchange for a cut of the profit, basically. But eventually there was an agreement at the end of a major war in the 1600s, after which the English government agreed to stop doing that. And after that, both parties kind of cooperated to varying degrees to clean up the piracy issue. After that, the Bahamas was not quite so happening a place. There wasn't really much to do there. And I think it wasn't for another couple hundred years that it turned into a tourist destination. And they were able to kind of make some money doing that. But that's like past 50 years, maybe. It's relatively recent. I guess another fun fact would be the Bahamas is actually in the Rio Treaty. I don't know if you remember that. That's the defense treaty the United States has with most of the Americas. Everybody remembers NATO. Some people maybe remember CETO. I don't think anybody remembers MITO anymore. But Rio Treaty, people haven't even heard of it for the most part.
What is it?
Well, it's basically the American equivalent of NATO, right? A mutual defense treaty between the United States and any number of countries in North and South America.
I see.
I did a whole podcast series on it, so that's actually on SoundCloud. Although I don't know if it's still up. I think I had to stop paying for that. Some kind of issue with the payment transaction. But yeah, the Bahamas had been a British territory until the 60s or 70s, I want to say. And then sometime in the 80s, it entered the Rio Treaty. And that's notable because I don't think hardly any other Caribbean country actually did that. Countries like, Barbados or whatever, most of them did not join the Rio Treaty. I think even countries in South America like Guyana and Suriname, after they became independent, they could have joined the Rio Treaty, but ultimately declined to do so. So the Bahamas is notable in that it's, as far as I know, the only country in the region that gained its independence in the mid-late 20th century and actually joined the Rio Treaty. And as a result, it's the only one in that group of countries that the United States is obligated by law to defend if it were to come under attack. Although realistically, if any country in the region came under attack, the US government would do something about it, because of course, Washington doesn't like other kids playing in its yard, so to speak.
Monroe Doctrine.
Pretty much, yeah.
This is our half. You guys get the other half.
Yeah, the Caribbean has been a little more happening, geopolitically speaking, over the past 10 years. Because for a long time, especially after the Cold War, there really wasn't any competition. But China has actually invested a lot in the region, and there's much more trade now with China than there had been before. So there is some reason for Washington to pay more attention where they really hadn't been for the past 30-some years. I think the main vehicle by which Washington expresses influence in the region is CARICOM. I believe that's what it's called. Basically, it's a international group that encompasses countries in the region and that facilitates the usual sort of supranational stuff. They meet over to talk about common issues, to plan cooperation on economic initiatives. I think they have their own bank, like a development bank specifically, that the US funds. And that is then used to fund infrastructure projects in this, that, or the other country that qualifies. So CARICOM had kind of been moribund for a long time, but then over the past 10 years, there's been relatively more attention paid to it. Although still not that much in the grand scheme of things. I really can't remember the last time I heard about a country in the Lesser Antilles getting any attention from Washington, foreign policy-wise. I do remember the Trump administration wanting to pay more attention to the Americas, and I think we even talked about the, that show of force, basically. They had the carrier battle group and an amphibious assault ship just kind of sailing around the Caribbean to intimidate. But it wasn't really clear who they were trying to intimidate for the most part. That's not the kind of attention the region really needs. The challenge is coming from trade with China, and you're not going to inhibit that by floating some naval ships around. You do actually have to increase economic ties and engage diplomatically in order to offset that kind of foreign influence. And Washington just, for whatever reason, doesn't seem well inclined to do that. And maybe they just don't have the muscle memory anymore. It's been a long time since Washington has had to do real strategic competition with a peer rival or even a near peer rival. So some of that institutional knowledge may have since been lost since the end of the Cold War. We're fortunate Sino-American competition isn't really a thing. We might be in trouble if it were. As is, both Beijing and Washington are actually much more focused on internal affairs than they are in any kind of major geopolitical struggle abroad, contrary to what people on YouTube seem to think.
We can't fight you. We're too busy fighting ourselves.
That really is very accurate. That pretty much is exactly what's happening in both countries. I forgot the Dutch Antilles. Embarrassing. The Dutch Antilles are basically an island chain that runs along the north of Venezuela. Have you ever heard of them? It's like Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, I believe. Yeah, they're popular tourist destinations. I think there was that one American teenage girl who went down there on a school graduation trip, and she ended up disappearing. And people thought she was trafficked for a long time, and it turned out that just some local had murdered her, basically.
Yikes.
Yeah, that was a famous case back in the day. What people may not know or remember is that the Dutch Antilles actually used to be a major center of oil refining. There's still some oil refining that happens there, but it's not as prominent as it used to be. They actually had, many decades ago, they might still have them, they used to have oil storage tanks and refineries on these little islands completely surrounded by water. And they would have to sort of unload them or load them by ship because there wasn't any land infrastructure to do it on. It was pretty wild. I remember those got targeted by German U-boats. Obviously, just being right on the water meant that they were vulnerable to U-boat guns. And so German U-boats would occasionally come by and just pop a few shots at the oil refinery infrastructure. I think that's most of the Caribbean. I don't even know like the little islands in Central America. There's a bunch of coastal islands on the east coast of Central America, and I've never even heard of like 99% of them. There's a couple that go deeper into the Caribbean, but again, there's nothing I know about them really. Have you ever heard of Navassa Island?
No.
That's actually an American island in the Caribbean, but it's not close to or part of Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. I believe it's west of Haiti. And nothing is there, right? It's not even really an island. It's really just more a rock in the ocean. And the only reason the U.S. owns it at all is because there was a big rush in the 19th century to claim islands covered in bird shit. I think we've talked about that before.
Yeah, you said that's part of why Hawaii wasn't really a high priority for some people. It wasn't shitty enough.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of other islands in the Pacific that were more attractive. And if you're wondering why bird shit was, desirable in the 19th century, it's because the bird shit in question had phosphate in it. And that was an ingredient for fertilizer in the 19th century. There was actually a crisis in the 19th century of agricultural productivity. Demand for food seemed to be outstripping the ability to produce more food. And so there was some question about how that would be dealt with. Fertilizer seemed to be the answer, but there just wasn't enough phosphate around. Because for a while, until the late 19th century, it was not known how to produce phosphate artificially. The chemical industry just wasn't advanced enough for that. So phosphate had to be extracted from, quote unquote, natural sources. And one of the main natural sources of phosphate was these buildups of bird shit on islands. Because these islands way out in the ocean, they have birds that had migrated over them for millennia, just like untold thousands of years. And over time, just the bird shit would accumulate into these big phosphate deposits that could actually be mined. And given how valuable phosphate was in the 19th century, if you could get control of these islands, then you could make a good amount of money. And so they became strategic assets for a while that European powers, including the United States government, actively sought out and even confronted each other over. So there's a number of tiny islands in the Pacific the United States controls, which are in that category. I think Howland Island is an example, maybe Midway. One of the more famous ones, and just a whole kit and caboodle of others. But Navassa Island, I believe, is one such example in the Caribbean. So the island itself has no population, there's nobody there. At one point, it had some phosphate deposits, and those were eventually fully exploited, and now it's just a rock in the ocean with nothing on it. I think the last time I read about it, the population was described as 50 feral goats, if I'm not mistaken. Something to that effect.
Were there any poop pirates who were trying to get the poop from the islands and sell it for profit?
No, I don't think so, because that was well after the age of piracy.
I see.
Yeah, we're talking 19th century. And it did cost a fair amount of money to, extract it and whatnot. It was a proper, mining operation. I don't think you could just go with a pickaxe and, get some bird shit and make enough money to make it worthwhile. It did have to be a relatively big operation to make it profitable.
I guess that shit had sailed.
I guess so.
Moss Neotech joined us. First words that he heard in stream were 50 feral goats. Good timing. Welcome.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to hear when you just join into a world discussion. Oh gosh, what else did we have? Was there anything else you wanted to ask about the Caribbean?
I don't think so.
Do you remember Eric Prince?
No. Who's that?
So I think people my age remember him from the Iraq War days. He was the guy that started and owned Blackwater, which was a mercenary company, or a private military contractor, as they prefer to call themselves these days. And they got in a lot of trouble over some killings. They kind of killed a bunch of civilians in a nasty incident that made headlines. And that's pretty much how most people, I think, first heard about Blackwater back in the day. And the guy that founded it ended up changing the name to something weird like C, like XI. And his name is Eric Prince, and he's still around. You occasionally hear about him in the news. Every couple of years, there's some kind of bizarre Eric Prince shenanigans I read about in some random country. I think 10 years ago, he was implicated in some kind of plot to overthrow a government in the Middle East. He's clearly, or at least he fancies himself anyway, some kind of adventurer. I think he was also implicated in that weird coup attempt in Venezuela during the first Trump administration. The one where they just had some guys in some boats land on the coast who were immediately arrested. It did not go well. So anyway, I bring him up because one of his firms has been hired to try to deal with the crisis in Haiti by the Haitian government. They want his mercenaries to come in and help them deal with the crime problem. That's almost certainly going to fail, because that's not the kind of problem that you can kind of shoot your way through, right? That's more of a social problem that has to do with crime, bad infrastructure, bad governance. There's a whole lot of factors that play into Haiti's current crisis. So getting some foreign mercenaries to run in and kill some people, even if it's some high-ranking gang members, that's probably not going to change the trajectory of the country. There's always going to be more gang members. So you really need to try to improve overall conditions first. Otherwise, you're just going to kill a bunch of people to no discernible effect. Also, I don't think it's going to change much, because sort of the big unspoken problem in Haiti is that a lot of the local elites are actually behind the violence. They actually have their own ties to individual gangs, and they use them to kind of fight each other. So that's a bigger issue probably than even the gang issue. There needs to be some kind of accord between these rival bosses in Haiti to try to get them to behave themselves and stop trying to slit each other's throats. until you get some progress there, then more violence is just going to feed the beast, so to speak. But the prospect of a misadventure has never stopped someone like Eric Prince before, so we'll see how this one goes. I suspect we'll find out in a few months. I don't doubt I'll be reading about it on the front page of some kind of news website.
And just to clarify, he's not actually a prince.
No.
I see.
Do you remember the, what was her name? The Secretary of Education in the first Trump administration? Wait, no, that's not right.
Don't know.
Betsy DeVos. That's her name. Google AI actually did something useful. I'm shocked. Yeah, Betsy DeVos. She's related to Eric Prince. I believe she is his brother. Sorry.
She's his brother.
She is his sister, rather. He is her brother. There we go.
Gotcha.
Yeah, her original name was Prince. And she married into the Davos family. So their family was quite well off, and presumably that's how Eric Prince was able to kind of fund his misadventures. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's always been my assumption. Well, since we're in the area, I could talk a little bit about Colombia. They were in the news recently.
What did they do?
It's nothing the government did. It's actually violence. There's been an upsurge in violence with rebel groups over the past couple months. It's an unfortunate trend. You know, there had been hope after the peace deal with FARC that things would improve over time. And in general, there was a period where that happened, but it's been kind of hit or miss over time. And in the past couple months, there's definitely been a spike. So there's a FARC splinter group called the EMC. I don't know what that stands for. But that is a splinter group, and they committed 2 specific acts of violence that were newsworthy within the past couple weeks. One of them was an attack on an aviation school. One of the big advantages the Colombian government has had, of course, over the course of its various conflicts, of which there are many with this, that, or the other rebel group over the past half century plus, has been helicopters and air assets generally. One of them was targeted. Again, one of the schools in which they trained people how to fly helicopters was targeted. And one of the helicopters on site was actually downed by a rebel-controlled drone, which I thought was very interesting. That's a sign of the times. Everybody kind of knew drones would be a big deal and that they would proliferate, but it's only really in the past couple of years we've really seen it kind of happening in a big way. And now it seems the technology has spread substantively to Colombia. I read in the same article about this that there have actually been other drone attacks in Colombia involving rebels. This is just the latest and most prominent example. Kind of interested in how they did it with the drone, though. Helicopters are not hard to bring down because they're not like really well armored or anything, but they are relatively hard targets if you're using like a quadcopter type drone. I would think that that would not really be viable, but maybe they got them during takeoff or landing, or maybe it wasn't a quadcopter drone and they had something more advanced. Regardless, the technology available to non-state actors is improving. Case in point. The other act of violence they were in the news for is a car bomb in the city of Cali, which injured 60 and killed 6. Oh, by the way, the helicopter that was brought down, 12 people died in that particular incident. So it's not like the helicopter was damaged and then crashed and people walked away. Like, they pretty much destroyed the helicopter and everybody on board died. So the car bomb killed 6, injured 60. and I'm not sure who the intended target was or if it was just like a generic terrorist attack. Make of that what you will. If anybody has more specific information on that, let us know. So these are all examples of recent violence, and they are apparently part of a trend, regrettably.
And this is FARC, you said, that's doing this?
It's not FARC. FARC technically doesn't exist anymore. As part of the peace deal that was agreed 10-some years ago, FARC technically disbanded. But there were a number of people in FARC who didn't agree with that, and they formed splinter groups. And those are generally very small and not especially well organized, but periodically they do engage in violence. And one particular group, the EMC, over the past couple months seems to have become particularly active for some reason.
What do they want?
I mean, in general, they want to overthrow the government and replace it with a socialist government. That is nominally what they want. Probably more specifically, they want the government to take the heat off. There are specific territories that groups like this operate in, and they generally control the drug trade in them. So if the government puts heat on them, they'll generally fight back and cause trouble in order to incentivize the government to leave them alone. So nominally, there's an ideological motivation, but in a lot of cases, rebel groups kind of devolve into de facto drug running operations. So probably it's more about the money, in truth. Let's see. Is there anything in the broader world you would be interested in?
I didn't really see anything that super stood out to me. There's someone who asked a kind of, I guess, tale as old as time question of, is there genocide happening in Gaza?
Yeah, there's always some. Israel-Palestine, everybody's favorite foreign policy hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
Is there genocide happening in Gaza? It depends on who you ask, because obviously the Israelis don't think so. The Israeli attitude is that if they wanted to kill everybody there, they could have done it by now. So the fact that they haven't is evidence that it's not. The Palestinian perspective is that the Israelis want them off the land. They want to colonize it. And so this is just a slow motion genocide. Yeah, genocide doesn't have to be, technically speaking, concentration camps and gas chambers. It can be done over a long period of time indirectly. So long as the goal is to depopulate a given territory and remove its people, that is a kind of targeted genocide, even if the methods are not as sophisticated as, say, what would have happened in Europe in the 1940s. But of course, that gets into a debate about intent. Is the intent of the conflict to displace the Palestinians and remove them through one means or the other? So obviously the Palestinians say, yes, they've always wanted the land, and this is just the latest iteration of that desire. The Israelis say that it's about the attack in October of 2023 now. It's been a while. This is about the attack in 2023 and retaliating to that and deterring future such violence. There's truth to both of those positions, but there's kind of a lot left out because, of course, if you're familiar with the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's been going on a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's over 100 years old now, so it's not something new happening. And so if you want to contextualize the conflict properly, you have to take into account the history. And the history is very, very messy. You could spend hours, just picking through all the details. I'm not your mother on here. I'm not going to tell people what to believe. They can figure it out themselves. If somebody wants to talk about the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we can do that. That can be interesting, but my experience is that people mostly just want an excuse to rant about whatever their particular position on the issue happens to be. So to me, the Gaza conflict is just the latest entry in a very long series of violent incidents between Israelis and Palestinians that goes back 100 years. It's not new, and it's going to keep happening. This is not going to be the last time by any stretch. The only thing that really surprises me about the conflict in Gaza is how long it's gone. You know, generally the pattern over the past 10, 20 years has been conflicts flare up in Gaza, and then they die out in a couple months, and then people move on until the next time a couple years later. So this time the Netanyahu government seems intent on trying to impose some kind of solution, no pun intended, on the issue. I don't think really that they're going to be successful. You know, counterinsurgency is not really a winning proposition, especially given, again, the context of this particular conflict. But the Netanyahu administration thinks otherwise, or if it doesn't think otherwise, has enough political motivation to continue on with the conflict anyway, to make it go on a little bit longer, or potentially a lot longer. So genocide or no, it's just part of an established pattern. That's basically my perspective on it.
Yeah, confirmation bias is another, I think, broader element that is not specific to this conflict, but oftentimes people get entrenched in a position and they're actively seeking out information that confirms their opinion rather than trying to understand the reasoning for why the other side is behaving why they do. And it doesn't mean that you're going to always change your position by studying opposing perspectives, but it can explain opposing perspectives in a way that you have greater understanding for the complexity of what's going on. And also just like the long-standing resentment that the people feel in the region. Like whichever side of the conflict that you're on, there has been death, and it's really hard to forgive death, especially of friends, family, and loved ones. So whenever your people are attacked, you find out who attacked them, you dislike them. That's a very normal human reaction, and it's one that's based on kinship and emotion, and it's not based on logic, statistics, policy, institutions, all those kind of things. So people are working from an emotional energy source rather than a practical one. And it's basically impossible to dissuade someone to stop disliking a group that has killed some of yours. They just have a very visceral energy regarding the situation that isn't going to be moved by your pleas to, okay, well, you should be nice to them now. It's like, okay, there's been a lot of hatred here for a very long period of time, and people are trying to get payback, so to speak. So the social media posts that Westerners share are not really going to have too much bearing on the outcome of what's happening over there. But we love to talk about it. It's kind of the armchair general thing of, well, if they just did this, it's like, okay, you can say that, but can you get them to actually shake hands and agree to something and then commit to that agreement? No.
Yeah, I think if not for American support for Israel over the past half century, people would barely care about it. Because there's plenty of violence happening in the world. You know, the pro-Israeli position that is frequently brought up is that, if the rest of the world genuinely cared about the Palestinian issue, then they would pay just as much attention to other conflicts where similar such examples of violence are happening, frequently worse, as is the fact that the Israelis come under special scrutiny seems to them like an example of discrimination.
There was a question about it. Are there examples where a land was taken over and the previous and new settlers managed to get along?
No. Short answer, no. although it kind of depends on what you mean by get along. Maybe South Asia. South Asia is an unusually chill civilization, globally speaking, so maybe there, but there's a lot of history that's missing in South Asia, so we can't even really say that with confidence. Yeah, like in China, for example, obviously Chinese civilization started in sort of the upper Yellow River and expanded out. And the attitude of the early Chinese towards the surrounding peoples that they ended up sort of conquering, colonizing, and absorbing into their culture was extremely condescending. Like, they thought very poorly of people that they saw as barbarians. And so the relationship was quite antagonistic in that regard. In the case of the far south of China, they didn't even really give them a chance to assimilate. What they would do is that they would send armies down to conquer the south, and then they would actually have the soldiers who were part of those armies settle in the conquered region. They would divvy up land in conquered areas and give it to the soldiers to till as farmers. And part of the deal was that they would actually take the local women of the conquered people and marry them off to the soldiers in order to create new Chinese citizens who would dominate the demography of the area. The men of the region, meanwhile, were just kind of screwed. They were either killed and enslaved or expelled. So that's not really a happy example, right? That's not really people getting along, per se. However, it did also work. So, the families that resulted from that did kind of assimilate into proper Han Chinese culture. And now the far south of China is a core part of Chinese civilization. So if you're talking like medium to long run, then yeah, everybody got along eventually. They just didn't really get along, so to speak, in the beginning. So that's kind of generally how it works. Obviously, the United States and its settlers had a lot of tension with Native Americans. That was not really like getting along. Pretty much a similar story in much of the Americas generally. I don't think anybody ever really got along per se, and it's taken a long time. There's still a lot of tensions in countries that have large native populations. Bolivia, for example, has a sort of left-wing Chavista government that had been led by Evo Morales, but he's kind of out of power right now. A lot of their legitimacy just came from the fact that it was largely a native movement. There's a large indigenous population in Bolivia, and there's a lot of tension between them and the sort of European descended population because they had traditionally been marginalized. So the Chavistas come along, and now suddenly the native population has a voice, and they were very popular correspondingly. The Chavistas are kind of losing popularity now, but that's kind of a whole other conversation. Yeah, I think in South Africa, do you remember the Zulu?
Yep.
Yeah, so they were kind of a warlike, conquering people that originally started out in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and then they migrated south into southern Africa, where they would eventually fight the British in what would become South Africa later on, the country of South Africa, not just the region. And they were known as assholes, right? They did not get along with the people who were already living there. The Zulu were known for being warlike and violent, and so the quote-unquote native population that they were invading did not like them at all. And they made for ready allies for later groups, like the Boers and the British that were active in the area. Yeah, there's just inherent tension when you get just large movements of people, especially when they're just actually invading. People don't really appreciate that very much. Yeah, no surprise that, Israel's experience has been one of lots of violence. The Zionist project was always going to incur a lot of wrath from locals. It should not have been a surprise. From what I've read of some of the early right-wing thinkers in the Zionist movement, way back in like the late 19th, early 20th century, they were well aware of that fact. They actually did assume that would happen. I think the main such thinker was Jabotinsky, He's the one I heard very specifically referenced. And he apparently was very clear at some of the early Zionist conferences in Europe that, if we're going to do this, then it's going to be ugly. So we need to be really committed here. Like, we should not expect this to be, we should not go in with delusions. And the reason he said that is because there were definitely people in the Zionist movement back in the day that had some delusions about it. They had a lot of European conceits that were very common in that age. So, for example, there were many, many apologists in the 19th century, which, of course, was the height of European imperialism. There were many apologists for imperialism. There was a sense that peoples beyond Europe were primitive and would benefit from European colonization and civilization. And that attitude affected the early Zionists. They actually shared that mindset. And there were many of them that argued that if there was mass migration of European Jews into what we call Palestine, basically the Levant, then the local population would welcome it, because they would be bringing with them European civilization, economic development, institutions, etc. And so everybody would be friends and get along and mutually benefit from each other's labor, skills, institutions, etc. It was just total pie in the sky bullshit. It was extremely arrogant. Like today, that would be considered borderline, well, if not actual racism. And that kind of logic was just very common at that time. That was just the sort of underlying impetus and cultural logic behind European imperialism. And Jabotinsky recognized that and wanted people just not to be ignorant like that. His attitude is, if we do this, people are going to fight back. They're not going to want us there. So we need to make sure that we're absolutely committed long-term to doing what's necessary to make this project work, no matter how ugly it gets. And that, again, was very much the sort of right-wing perspective in the Zionist movement. And you can kind of see the tension between those two perspectives across Israel's political history. Netanyahu and his party, what is it? It slips my mind. Somebody tell me, what is Netanyahu's party? That's going to bug the hell out of me. I should not be forgetting that. Likud, there it is. Right, so Netanyahu and Likud have their ideological origins within the spectrum of Israeli politics in Jabotinsky. Like, there's a pretty direct through line between Likud going back 100 years to Jabotinsky and like-minded people within the Zionist movement at that time. And in turn, the current, does Israel even have a left wing anymore? In so much as it does, it has its ideological origins within the spectrum of Israeli politics going back to the people Jabotinsky was arguing against in those early Zionist conferences. And so there's this sort of continuous tension and through line throughout Israel's history, even before it was independent, like going back to the era when it was just Jewish settlers and the Jewish territory was being run by the Jewish agency within the Mandate territory. Like, even then, there was this tension between them. It's just been an ongoing issue. For a long time, it was actually the leftists that kind of dominated the spectrum. Jabotinsky was there, and his ideological descendants were always present, generally committing horrific acts of violence. You're not going to like the right wing of Israeli politics the more you learn about its history. They get real nasty. Those are people that have a very Manichean view of history and morality. Their attitude is that the ends justify the means. The Jews of the world need a homeland, and anything they can do to get one, and after they had one, anything they can do to expand it and make it safer, all of that is justified to them. And that's one of the reasons there's been so much conflict in the region. That's a whole other debate we could get into. But the left wing, meanwhile, kind of took a slightly different attitude and was generally kind of chiller to varying degrees. Ben-Gurion is kind of an exception. He was the first leader of independent Israel, and Ben-Gurion had actually already been leader of the Jewish agency within the Mandate territory before Israeli independence. So he's a major figure in the history of Israel. He's like one of their major early elder statesmen. Nominally, Ben-Gurion was actually a leftist. He was on the left of the political spectrum. However, the way that he governed and dealt with Israel's foreign policy actually probably has more in common with the Jabotinsky Likud side of Israeli politics. That's another aspect of Israeli political history that, regardless of who's in office, a lot of them kind of manage foreign relations in a pretty similar way. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Netanyahu may actually kind of model himself on Ben Gurion in a lot of ways. Fun fact, Ben Gurion thought Israel would just collapse without him. He was one of those guys. He was one of those people that thought he was absolutely indispensable to the success of his government and country. He didn't believe anybody else had what it took, not only to run Israel, but to make sure that it survived. And so much so that he believed at the end of his career that Israel would maybe only exist for another like 10, 20 years or whatever. I see a lot of that attitude in Netanyahu. I think he himself probably believes that Israel would not make it without him or somebody like him.
Hubris.
How did we get onto that? What was the question?
Is there genocide happening in Gaza?
Oh, right. I was getting off on tangents.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Adding context is all we can really do at this point.
Pretty much. Yeah, well, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. The Israel-Palestine issue is almost always a good trigger for that. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later, and we do enjoy the feedback.
Shout out to Twitch chat and the YouTube commenters. Appreciate you.
Let's see. Did we have any other questions?
Fuzzy Cord is remote this week, so I've just been verbally passing on the questions so far.
Understood.
Chat, if you have any, you can tag me, and I can mouth off.
What else did I have for this week? Oh, somebody last week asked about thoughts on Indonesian politics. I don't know if that person is still in chat, but if so, I could talk a little bit about that. Have we talked about that before? I feel like maybe it's come up once or twice.
I don't think so. We have a guild member of Creation, our WoW guild, who is from Indonesia. I always forget that it's a Muslim country, but
oh yeah, it's a big Muslim country. Technically, it's the biggest. Indonesia has the highest population of any majority Muslim country.
What's the history of that? Forget.
Of Islamic expansion into Indonesia?
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked. Always appreciate a technical question, much less thorny than, is there genocide in one of the world's main hotspots? Yeah, so I guess the short answer is trade. Regional traders in the Indo-Pacific have long been disproportionately Muslim. And, obviously that just stems from Arabs being major traders. They trade with people, they spread the religion, and then it just kind of acts as a chain reaction from there, moving from port to port, merchant to merchant. So in the case of Indonesia, it was the same thing. Indonesia, especially on the island of Java and the southeast coast of Sumatra, had long been major centers of trade in Southeast Asia. And so they had a number of major ports. I think one of the big ones was, Malacca was the big one, but that wasn't technically in modern-day Indonesia. But regardless, that just illustrates that the area was a major trade locus. So Muslim merchants from the Middle East and then South Asia basically expanded, over time into Southeast Asia. And as they did so, they brought their religion with them, and they just started converting people. If you're a merchant, Islam kind of brings certain perks because it does basically encourage people very strongly to not be shitheads, And if you're a merchant and you're dealing with people who can easily defraud you, it's pretty helpful if they're of a faith that encourages them to be honest. It's obviously not foolproof, but better than nothing. So as trust between Muslim traders increased, that created an incentive to convert so that you could participate in the high trust trade happening in your area. So correspondingly, Islam became fairly popular fairly quickly in Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia, where, again, trade networks had major nodes. It used to be Hindu originally. There was a lot of South Asian influence in Southeast Asia for a long time. You can still see that in places like Burma and Thailand, which are still Buddhist today. Keep in mind, Buddhism originated in India and kind of emanated out from there. So residual Buddhism in the region is actually the result, not just of conversion, but also Indian influence. Hinduism in Indonesia was similar. Hinduism spread to the region through Hindu priests of one kind or another, as well as to a lesser degree through trade. The only vestige of Hinduism in Indonesia left is pretty much Bali. You've probably heard about Bali. That's a major tourism destination. Australians in particular go there a lot. So Bali is the last island, I think the only island at this point in Indonesia that has any significant Hindu population. It is, I believe, majority Hindu, but I don't even think there's a minority Hindu population in other parts of Indonesia. Some interesting history in Bali. The noble family that owned it for a long time was descended from one of the last Hindu royal families to rule in Java. And they lost a power struggle and ended up expelled and took refuge in Bali, where their descendants continued to rule for centuries, up until independence when, Dutch rule, I guess, / independence, when the local nobility were disempowered in favor of modern institutions of government. But yeah, it was pretty much just a straight shot to convert the rest of the territory once Islam kind of established itself in the ports. It just spread naturally inland from there. I think the main centers of Islam in Indonesia are Sumatra and Java. Those are like 90, 99%, whatever, Muslim. Once you get further east, then things get a little more mixed. At that point, you start seeing some of the religious flashpoints where communal violence sometimes happens between religious communities. Yeah, the Spice Islands, sort of in the eastern part of Indonesia, were initially discovered and settled by Christians, specifically, I think, Dutch and Portuguese. So they have a much stronger Christian presence there, although I think even in that case, it's only like 50%. I don't know that there's any majority Christian islands in the Indonesia, although I could be wrong. I think Celebes, I can never remember how to pronounce it. It's that weird-looking big island in Indonesia that looks like a really raggedy ass to X. Yeah, that's majority Muslim. I think it has a large minority of Christians, something like 20, 30%, whatever. Borneo is even weirder. Borneo is the big one that looks like a circle. And that's actually rainforest. So it was very difficult to settle Borneo for a very long time. For the most part, people didn't bother. Even the Dutch, when they colonized it, only really colonized the coast. And even that was just because there was oil there. They never really bothered much with the interior. So it's only really been in the past 100 years that there's been substantive efforts to send in, what would you call them? Proselytizers. There's been Islamic and Christian priests that have moved into Borneo to try to convert the locals. That's mostly a process that has occurred over the past 100 years. So there's lots of Borneo that still have native pagan populations, but I think a majority at this point has converted to one or the other monotheistic religion. I think Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism are the three main religions.
Yeah, because I think the Philippines was colonized by Spain.
Correct. Which must have been trippy for the Portuguese. You're about as far from Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula as you can get going east, and you think you're going to settle and colonize all this well-off, fancy Spice Island territory, and then who do you meet but the fucking Spaniards coming from the other direction? Must have been very disappointing. Yeah, Philippines was settled and colonized by the Spanish. And correspondingly, the Philippines is like very, very Catholic. Until you get to the southernmost island, Mindanao, they actually have a large Muslim minority there. So that's sort of the transition zone between the Christian colonized Spice Islands and Philippines and the Muslim dominated Java, Sumatra. That transition zone being Mindanao, Borneo, and Celebes, however it's pronounced. So yes, Muslim. There's also Papua New Guinea. Actually, it's not Papua New Guinea, it's Western Guinea. Are you familiar with Papua New Guinea?
Yes, I can kind of visualize where it is on the map, but I know almost nothing about it.
Oh, okay. Well, we could talk about that since it's relevant to the Indonesian question. So Papua New Guinea is very, very underdeveloped, very little infrastructure. I think it's technically covered in rainforest, or at least tropical forest. It's very wet. It's difficult to build infrastructure because just the environment is so moist and because there's so little infrastructure already. And there's very little in the way of modern economic activity. It's mostly agricultural. Even more than that, the population is mostly tribal. There was actually, I was watching this on YouTube a couple weeks ago. There was a French documentarian that actually went there and filmed like a war between tribes. They were fighting on a hill, like in a way that would not have been out of place like 20,000 years ago. Very old school stuff. It was pretty wild to watch. There are like pockets of urbanism, but the urban spaces are very, very small. They're more like towns than cities. I think Port Moresby is the largest urban settlement. So let's see, Christians converted most of it. I think there's still pockets of paganism, but for the most part, I think the tribal population did convert. That hasn't stopped them from occasionally engaging in tribal violence, but even that has improved over time. The population, the native population, is mostly Melanesian, I believe. Let me check that. I'm always getting Austronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian confused with each other. Yeah, I think Melanesian is correct. Okay. So the unique thing about Melanesians is that they're very distinctive from the other peoples in the Pacific. So when you think of a native ethnic group in the Pacific, what do you think of? You probably think of something like Hawaiian Islanders or Samoans or some other island group like that, right? That's sort of the mental image you get. I don't know how many people have seen the Disney movie, what was it, Momoa, something like that?
Moana.
There you go, Moana. That's sort of Polynesian culture, and that's more what people imagine when they imagine the Pacific. That is a major sort of racial / ethnic group in the region, but the Melanesians are the other one. So are you familiar with, sorry, got a sore throat for some reason. Are you familiar with the indigenous population of Australia?
Yes.
Yeah. So they have very dark skin. They kind of have matted hair, and their faces almost look more African than Asian, right? So that's a distinctive group. They're not Polynesians, and they're not descended from Polynesians. Indigenous Australians are, in fact, Melanesian. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about Melanesians. But they're not just restricted to Australia. They also exist in islands around Australia. And the main such example is Papua New Guinea. So basically, Australian indigenous peoples, but living in a tropical island environment. More or less, roughly, that's what we're talking. I think they're also dominant in Fiji as well as the native population. But there's also a big non-native population in Fiji, so they're not nearly as prominent. In Papua New Guinea, I think like 90% of the population is still native, like Melanesian of one kind, of one ethnic or tribal group or another. So that's like quick and dirty Papua New Guinea. Now, the island of Guinea is cut in half. The eastern half is the independent country that we now know as Papua New Guinea. Even Papua New Guinea actually used to be two separate imperial territories. The northern one was ruled by the British, and the southern half was actually ruled by the Germans. And it wasn't until after World War I, when as part of the Treaty of Versailles, that the Germans ceded control of their part of Papua New Guinea to the British and created the modern borders of what we now know as Papua New Guinea. Now, the western half of the island of Guinea was controlled by the Dutch, and it was part of the Dutch Empire. Now, interestingly, it was not originally part of Indonesia. When Indonesia became independent, they took with them the islands of Java, Sumatra, Celebes, Borneo, and a bunch of the smaller island chains, but not Western Guinea. That, after Indonesian independence, which I think was 1948, Western Guinea remained part of the Dutch Empire. Now, the Indonesian government, the newly independent, that is to say, Indonesian government, did not like that. They were very upset about that because they thought all of former Dutch territory in the region should go to them. That was their attitude. Now, the Dutch argument was that the people of West Guinea had virtually nothing in common with the rest of the people in Indonesia, because the people of Indonesia are Polynesian, Austronesian, sort of, very different than the Melanesians. And so the Dutch attitude is that the Melanesian population of West Guinea should have different government. The Indonesian government rejected that just wholesale. Their attitude is that that should be part of our country, and we're not going to stop agitating you about it until you cede it. And for the next couple decades, the Dutch actually held on to West Guinea through the 1950s, 60s. But then in 1975, the Dutch government, under pressure from the Indonesian government and probably also a little bit Washington, finally caved in and agreed to not make West Guinea an independent country or to allow it to merge with Papua New Guinea, but rather to allow Indonesia to annex it. And so that was the end of colonial Dutch rule in West Guinea. Now, the native population of West Guinea was not really consulted in all of this. And the result is that there is not inconsiderable tension between the Melanesian people of West Guinea and the rest of Indonesia. And there actually has been an intermittent, although relatively weak, independence movement in West Guinea that has been active for the past 50-some years. Their trouble is that they have virtually no resources. Again, we're talking about people who are living like tribal lifestyles. So they don't have access to like a wealthy middle class that can help fund their independence effort. They pretty much have to operate with very bare bones resources. And they're up against well-connected mining companies in Indonesia that set up shop in West Guinea, as well as Indonesian nationalists who have settled there and see it as an integral part of their country and reject any notion that it should be separate. Mind you, separatism has long been a major issue in Indonesia because it is so ethnically diverse. Nationalists have always expected that there would be centrifugal ethnic forces pulling apart the country. And so in order to counter that, nationalists have gone very hard over the course of Indonesia's history to clamp down on ethnic nationalism of one kind or another. So they see West Guinean ethnic nationalism as being no different and a threat to the country, and they've cracked down on that, just like they have everybody else. But they've been less successful, relatively speaking, in matching that with a corresponding effort to build Indonesian nationalist identity in West Guinea. So they did successfully do that in the rest of Indonesia. Like, Indonesian nationalism is a real thing. The national identity is embedded across the country. But in West Guinea, it's much weaker because the cultural deviation is so great, and because of that long-standing tension, over between the desire for Indonesian national control and native desire for autonomy. So technically, West Guinea is part of Indonesia, but it's a contentious addition to the country.
Are they religiously kind of whatever their native belief system is, or did they join on the Muslim thing?
I think it's a mix of pagan and Christian. I haven't read as much about Islamic activity, that is to say, Islamic efforts to proselytize amongst the people of West Guinea. I would have to look that up. But I think that it's more Christians than Muslims. There is a Muslim population there, but it's mostly migrants, people from the rest of Indonesia that came there for work. I don't know how many Melanesian people themselves have actually converted.
Interesting. I didn't know about that ethnic difference between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and stuff.
So that's a rough history of Islamic expansion in Indonesia.
Cool.
And the corresponding, regional transition zones and whatnot. Now, political history is also interesting. So you might assume that Indonesia, having been a Dutch colony, must have at one point been granted independence by the Indonesian government, and that the Indonesian government must then be descended from the colonial Dutch government that had governed it before independence. This is basically how it works with virtually every country that eventually received independence after being colonized by a European power. However, this is actually not how it worked with the Indonesian government. They had a different evolution, and you may find it interesting just how different that evolution was. So what happened is that there was, of course, an independence movement in Indonesia, and the Dutch government was kind of moving towards giving them relatively more autonomy, as was sort of the trend in the early 20th century. And then, out of nowhere, come the Japanese. Japan invades Indonesia during World War II. So, of course, Japan dismantles the colonial architecture, they dismantle the colonial government, and they replace it with a new government. However, they do not replace it with a Japanese colonial government. What they do is they set up a local puppet government that is run by Indonesian nationalists. And this becomes the new government of Indonesia. Now, you might say that these people are collaborators and whatnot, but keep in mind that if you are a nationalist, then from your perspective, you're basically trading one master for the other, and the new master is at least pretending to give you an autonomous government. So that is an improvement from the perspective of somebody who's been fighting to kick the foreigners out, specifically the Dutch. So a lot of nationalists kind of join up and are eager to support the new independent government, even if it's only technically independent. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Japanese colonial policy during World War II, you know that eventually the Japanese pretty much lose all legitimacy because they're actually much harsher than the previous European masters were in most of these territories. Japan suffers from a shortage of food, so they start appropriating food in the colonial territories, creating famine conditions in much of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. They also force many thousands, maybe millions of people in conquered territory to work as forced labor, basically slaves. And many of those people never came home. Many of them starved to death or were otherwise worked to death by the Japanese. So correspondingly, the new government increasingly itself lost legitimacy, and nationalists faced a conundrum, because on the one hand, they wanted to support their new Indonesian government, but on the other hand, they wanted the Japanese out, even more than they wanted the Dutch out. So the result is a nascent insurgent movement that started turning on the new government. Now, that lasted until the end of the war, and at the end of the war, there was a very weird situation, because they had the Japanese puppet government still in place. The Dutch wanted to return, but the Dutch government did not have the military forces to do so, because, of course, the Netherlands had been conquered by the Germans, and so they were not doing well. The Netherlands was very much in recovery mode at the end of World War II. So the Dutch government requested that the British move in and secure the territory for them on their behalf. And the British, for their part, wanted to ensure that the Japanese garrison surrendered, so they were happy to move into the country. So for a while, Indonesia was basically governed and run by a combination of British troops and the former Japanese puppet government, which was nominally still in place. Now, the Dutch wanted to replace that Japanese government with their former colonial government. The British didn't really give a shit. They just wanted this to kind of resolve itself peacefully so that they could save some money. The British were not in a good state financially by the end of World War II. Now, what ended up happening is that the Dutch nationalists rejected the demands of the Dutch government to cede power to the former colonial authority. And they, in turn, launched an insurgency against the sort of pseudo-British regime that had been created. So Indonesian nationalists in the puppet government kind of had to decide if they wanted to continue to maintain loyalty to the interim British government or the part of the Indonesian nationalist government that was now fighting actively for independence. And again, they were mostly fighting against the British, not the Dutch, who didn't even want to be there. So the whole thing was absolutely bizarre. It gets even more bizarre when you consider that the British didn't have enough troops to fight an insurgency, and the only other troops on the island were Japanese POWs who had been governing the island before. So the British did the bizarre thing, and they actually tapped demobilized Japanese soldiers and remobilized them as part of their command structure to fight Indonesian nationalists, insurgents that those Japanese soldiers had been previously working with. It's quite the little drama. Now, Dutch troops were eventually introduced, but ultimately it was clear to all parties involved that it was unsustainable. The Indonesian nationalists had too much support. The Dutch were too weak, the British too disinterested to fight some kind of long war to reconquer Indonesia. And so a peace agreement was signed that actually ceded control of the territory to the Indonesian nationalist government. Again, this is the same government that had been set up by the Japanese. So unlike in other territories that had been European colonized, that were conquered by the Japanese and that were subsequently turned back over to colonial authorities, the temporary puppet government set up by the Japanese in Indonesia actually survived the end of World War II and became the legitimate government of Indonesia. And that is the actual genesis of the modern Indonesian government that continues to govern today. Very weird, very unique story. You don't really see that anywhere else.
It's a lot of changing hands and different plans for them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, at first Indonesia, after independence, had like a sort of center-left nationalist leader. That was very common at the time. If you were a nationalist in the developing world, then you were probably also a socialist. The two kind of went hand in hand for a lot of movements back then. Part of the reason for that is just anti-capitalism. Keep in mind, a lot of the colonial regimes that were set up in the rest of the world, in Southeast Asia, Africa, etc., were very, very extractive and oriented in a sort of free market extractive political economy. And so naturally then nationalists kind of took on a very skeptical view of capitalism because they saw it as being complicit in the exploitation and subjugation of their countries. That's only really started to change in the past quarter century. Now you actually have seen the emergence of prominent pro-free market nationalist movements in much of the developing world. But at first, in the mid-20th century, relatively rare. Almost all of them were relatively socialist. And the first leader of Indonesia post-independence, I believe, was Sukarno. And he was more of a socialist bent, but he was not a communist. However, communists were part of the coalition. Anybody and everybody who wanted an independent Indonesia was basically all part of the same coalition. Communists and nationalists alike were on the same page in that regard. But there was growing tension between them after independence on account of the Cold War. There was a lot of mistrust there. Over the course of the 1950s, that was manageable. But then in the 1960s, things came to a head. Part of the problem is that Chinese were suspected of being communists on account of, obviously, the Communist Revolution being so successful in China. And in turn, there was much suspicion in Southeast Asia that ethnic Chinese minorities were secretly in league with the Communist Party of China to one degree or another. In Malaysia, there was a whole revolution fought by Chinese communists against the colonial authorities there. So this was not entirely paranoia, like this was an actual thing that did happen. And there was concern that other Chinese minorities in the region may be similarly subject to communist sympathies, which was not true. Most of them were actually very entrepreneurial, very anti-communist. But there was enough communist sentiment, especially amongst working class Chinese in the region, that the communists were able to kind of get footholds here and there that they used to engage in agitation, sometimes violence. The result of this was actually a big crackdown across Southeast Asia that resulted in the expulsion of many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of ethnic Chinese from the region. This is actually one of those big ethnic expulsion events in the 20th century that kind of is undersold. A lot of people haven't heard about it. Because when you think about ethnic violence in the 20th century, you kind of think of Europe. That's the go-to. Europe, for the worse, kind of set the gold standard in that regard. So all the other big ethnic expulsions and expressions of ethnic violence got overshadowed by that. The Armenian genocide is an example in the Middle East. A lot of the Middle East kind of turned on the Armenians in the early 20th century, but that event was overshadowed by the concentration camps in Germany and Poland in the 1940s. So after World War II, there was a similar explosion of ethnic sorting in Europe, obviously. That's why we have ethnically homogenous countries in Europe today. There was probably more ethnic cleansing after World War II in the immediate aftermath than there was during the war on account of that degree of sorting to create ethnically homogenous countries. That's a whole conversation unto itself. But there was a similar event in the 1950s in Southeast Asia where ethnic Chinese populations were suspected of being a threat and then were discriminated against and in pretty significant numbers expelled from their home countries, some of which, in some cases for which they had been living in for multiple generations. Pretty sad story overall, but 20th century has many such cases. So this is just another entry. Indonesia was no exception. They had a large Chinese minority. Well, I shouldn't say large, it's like 5 to 10%, whatever. It was notable. And they were disproportionately well off because a lot of them were merchants of one kind or another. That didn't stop them from being suspected of being communists. And so they came under significant scrutiny in the 1950s. And that was just part of a broader communist paranoia within Indonesia. And of course, the CIA was happy to stoke that. They actually went so far as to prop up a separatist rebellion in Sumatra early in Indonesia's existence. Mind you, the CIA and Washington in general saw a lot of developing world leaders as being Soviet sympathizers because they were socialist leaning. And Sukarno was no exception. Sukarno wanted to be non-aligned in the Cold War, and the CIA was very suspicious of so-called non-aligned leaders. They saw them as basically being they saw them as sympathizing with the Soviets, but just not wanting to openly admit it. And so they treated them as rivals, if not outright enemies. So in the case of Indonesia, they propped up a rebellion in Sumatra that went pretty much nowhere after a few years. But that created some bad blood there. Let's see, and then in the mid-1960s, that's when things really popped off. Because at that point, the communists had built up significant support in Indonesia by that point, and they staged a coup attempt. This is my understanding of it. I could certainly do to learn more about the details, but my understanding is that there was a coup attempt and that it started with the targeting of certain nationalist generals. And the generals survived the assassination attempts and then rallied and then launched one of the big purges of Southeast Asia, maybe one of the big purges of the 20th century. They went after communists wherever they could find them and killed them in significant numbers. And because the Chinese were suspected of being communists, there were a number of Chinese who were killed basically just for being Chinese. A significant example of ethnic violence. There's actually a documentary, which I still haven't seen, despite it being on my watch list for almost 10 years or so. It's called The Killing Fields, I think. Wait, Killing Fields is Cambodia. Yeah, it's Cambodia. All right, there's a documentary out there about this specific period of Indonesia's history. And the documentarian actually interviewed Indonesian nationalists that were involved in the killing. And from what I've read about it and what little I've seen of it, they're actually not ashamed of it. Like, they're quite open about all of the killing they did, and they're very, I don't know, unrepentant, I guess is the appropriate word. Anyway, I think something like 500,000 to 1 million people died. It was some very unexpectedly large number. Yeah, Indonesia, again, has a very large population. It's very densely populated. I think it takes people off guard. For those who don't know, the population of Indonesia is something like 270 million people. It's probably bigger by now. I think that was what it was like 10 years ago. According to Google, it's now 283.5 million.
Damn.
Yeah, so not too much smaller than the United States. What is that, like 40 million smaller than the US? So when shit goes wrong in a densely populated country, you're going to end up with lots of casualties. And that's what happened in the mid-1960s in Indonesia. There was a massive purge of communists and also fellow travelers, or even people who were just suspected of being communists. And it was at this point that one of the generals involved in the counter coup, you could say, seized control of the country. And that's, of course, Suharto. And this is sort of the swan song of Sukarno. He steps down, Suharto moves in, and he sets up a military dictatorship that would go on to rule Indonesia for the next 30 years, I believe. 1965 to 1997, thereabouts. And as you might expect, Suharto and his government were very, very friendly to the United States. They did not like communists, and in fact killed them virtually whenever they could. The authoritarian government he set up was known for not giving much of a shit about human rights. Fun fact, one of the special forces guys who worked for the Suharto government, is the current sitting president of Indonesia. And as you might expect, there's lots of stories about his potential involvement in significant human rights abuses back in the Suharto era. That's a whole conversation unto itself.
Chat says the video was called The Act of Killing.
Thank you. It was some kind of killing, act of killing. I need to sit down and watch that. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Anyway, that pretty much covers most of the Cold War and a little bit after. Democratization happened in the mid-late 90s, and Indonesia has been a democracy ever since. They've done relatively well, although the current government brings some of that into question. But, you know, it was inevitable that sooner or later they were going to get some kind of like nationalist, military-aligned government in power in the democratic era. So this is sort of a stress test. If they can get past this, then Indonesia democracy is going to look pretty strong. But if it regresses, they're going to have to start from scratch, which would be regrettable given all of the gains they've made over the past, 30-some years now. So that's your quick and dirty Indonesia history and politics, which I guess was the original question.
Awesome. I knew almost nothing of that. New chatter is wondering if you're native Indonesian.
I'm not. Now, most of what I know about Indonesia, I learned when I was much younger, when I was interested in the Cold War. And I spent some time studying the details of that. And then when you study countries in one context, sometimes you get interested in just kind of look into different contexts and build up a repertoire of background knowledge. So after reading about Indonesia in the Cold War context, I read about it in the World War II context, cultural context, demographics, etc. And then just over time learned more, just kind of organically.
There was another question. What is your preferred type of government and why?
My preferred type, I mean, just personally, I'm pretty familiar and comfortable with democracy. I mean, I'm certainly American democracy could do better. It's probably due for some updates, but like just in general, broadly speaking, yeah, representative government is pretty a-okay as far as I'm concerned. If you want something more detailed than that, like what kind of democratic government, man, I don't know. That's tough because I doubt my own preferences are going to align with like most people. Most likely, I mean, it kind of gets into a question of what is the best government, right? That's almost always where these conversations end up going, because everybody thinks their preference is the best, and very rarely does that actually end up aligning with the truth. But we can debate all day about what makes a good government, and I've talked a lot about good institutions, good governance, et cetera, over time. I think all of that is relevant here. But ultimately, you can only be so objective when you're talking about something like politics and systems of government, because the reality is human behavior is unpredictable. People break things, people break institutions. And if you can design an ideal government, if people don't like the trade-offs that are necessary to implement and maintain that government, then they're going to change it. So ultimately, I think the question of what the best type of government is whatever kind of government that is preferred and acceptable to a critical mass of a given body politic. That's my technical academic definition of what would be an ideal government. And that could be a government that's really shitty, maybe not even democratic, but ultimately anything that deviates from that equilibrium, what people are willing to accept, what most people in a given body politic are willing to accept or preferably prefer. Anything besides that, they're going to deviate from sooner or later. They're going to destroy it. They will break it. People will only tolerate institutions of government that deviate from their preferences for so long before they eventually take up arms or otherwise undermine it. Like, it's going to fail. You're going to end up with some kind of equilibrium eventually. So preferably, regardless of personal preferences, regardless of what's objectively considered the best type of government, ultimately you will have to cater the design of any given government system to the needs, preferences, and eccentricities of a given body politic. You have to do that. It's what you're inevitably going to do in the long run. Anything else is just destined to failure in the long run. Short term, you may have some success, but anything more than that, and you're dreaming. So in the case of the United States, given the political preferences that are dominant in the United States, we're probably predestined to have some kind of laissez-faire type government, pretty much in perpetuity. You know, barring some kind of change in the overarching, underlying culture that informs political preferences, that's probably going to be the case regardless of what happens. I would not be surprised if the United States leaned left over time, just because the country is getting, I don't want to say, what's the right word? I don't want to say more leftist per se, because left and right are kind of subjective, and the relative orientation of what constitutes left and right changes with time. I would say that more and more of the United States is more labor driven, because that's basically what happens when you have economic development. You need labor to power that development. You end up with more laborers, and then politics orients more towards the labor voters, because they, of course, being laborers, want politics that reflect their interests as laborers. So in broad swaths of the United States, you don't have big urban conglomerations that have millions of laborers demanding pro-labor politics of one kind or another. And so in turn, what we would call now conservative politics dominates in those areas. But as those areas have developed, they have attracted more development, more laborers, and they have tended to shift towards what we would call the political left, which more or less is a proxy for pro-labor politics, although you could at this point argue the Republican Party is more pro-labor, depending on how you want to define that. We're in a very messy political era right now where the parties are, well, where the governing coalitions that define each party are in realignment. That's happened before, it takes time. So things are a little fuzzy right now. But in general, urbanization and econ development equal more pro-labor politics over time. Colorado used to be very conservative. Now it's pretty left-leaning and Democrat-oriented because there's been more economic development that's brought in more people and more laborers. California, same thing, used to be an arch-conservative state. Now it's arch-liberal. California conservatism did not survive the massive influx of workers into the state, unsurprisingly. That's pretty much the fate of all parts of the United States. Eventually, there's going to be economic development that spreads everywhere and leads to influx of peoples that change the political orientation and culture of areas that are now predominantly conservative. It's pretty much unavoidable because conservatives in the United States, as we define conservatism right now, generally prefer pro-growth, pro-business policies that, for the most part, are successful at generating economic growth. But again, doing so attracts lots of laborers, and those people have different political preferences. We've seen this process play out multiple times in the United States. I see no reason not to expect it to happen again. And eventually there will be a tipping point where the overall center of American politics shifts in a more pro-labor direction. I don't think we'll ever be like Europe in that regard. We probably missed the boat on that for historical reasons, but just in general, the weight of political opinion I would expect would shift to the left over time, at least as far as labor. I don't know that it'll happen in other areas like social issues or peripheral issues of political import, but in terms of labor anyway, I suspect that will happen.
Isn't it more so Europe that missed the boat?
In a literal fashion, yes.
In a logistical sense?
Yeah. Yeah, some of them missed the boat. They didn't want to come. I don't blame them. Yeah, people kind of forgot, but the Americas used to be known. And when I say the Americas, I don't just mean Latin America, but like the United States as well, used to be considered very violent. Like back in the 19th century, it was considered very violent, not only in terms of like crime. I imagine people will hear me say, oh, it used to be thought of as violent. Well, it's still violent. Look at all the crime. Not just in terms of crime, like consider how many more civil wars there were in the Americas in the 1800s. Like there was barely a decade in the 1800s when there was not some kind of revolution or major civil war or international conflict somewhere in the Americas. So even by the standards of the 19th century, which in general was much more violent than now, the Americas were considered unstable and violent. So a lot of the people coming even to the United States were fairly risk tolerant. They kind of knew what they were getting into when they were coming. And that in turn put off a lot of people. So those were the people that missed the boat, the people that looked at the Americas and said, I don't really want to die. I'd rather just try to hack it out here as best as possible.
Valid.
How are we doing on time?
Doing good. It's 2 hours 15 we've done, so however long you want to go, I'm down.
Fair enough.
I am down to VG3 later too, if you so desire.
Sounds fun. I don't know how much use I'll be. It's almost 1 a.m. Oh, half an hour to 1 a.m. So we did have a question from last week. What does the European leaders' trip to the U.S. signify? Seems abrupt. This is in reference to the Alaska summit, where Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin. And European leaders were concerned about that because Trump and his administration, as per usual with them, did not really deign to coordinate with European allies about just what he would be talking about, or the potential ramifications for topics of discussion during the meeting for European affairs, specifically Ukraine, but also others. So European leaders have long since noticed that if you want to influence the Trump administration, you need to be the last guy that talks to him. So if somebody you don't like is talking to him, you better make sure that you make an appointment so you can at least try to offset whatever damage the last guy did. So in effect, that's what they were doing. They noted that Putin would be talking with Trump for a while, and so they wanted to organize a meeting to try to, one, coordinate with Trump, to try to see what they were talking about and understand the implications for their own preferences and policies, and then also, in turn, try to influence Trump in a way that was more favorable to their perspective on issues like Ukraine and whatnot. So I don't think that they were necessarily afraid for some specific reason. I don't think that they had intelligence that Trump was going to sell them out to Putin, and they wanted to try to offer him a deal to change his mind. I think this is just standard operating procedure at this point for how to handle Trump, so to speak, after he's met with some kind of major rival. You want to make sure you get your 2 cents in.
Human attention span is not at its apex.
Yeah, regrettably, that is the case. Let's see, we got the Indonesia question. I guess I didn't really get into like modern Indonesian politics. That's a whole topic unto itself. If somebody wants to get into that, let me know. Oh, we didn't talk about Trump, right?
Nope.
I don't talk a whole lot about Trump because, as was pointed out to me months ago, if we just covered all of the Trump stuff happening, we would talk about virtually nothing else. So I tried to kind of put that in the background and deprioritize it. I try to talk only about the highlights. So this week's highlight reel includes a fact check I did on the big ball carjacking thing. So I think it was a couple guys in chat were pointing out that the story was not that he was carjacked. It was that a woman was carjacked and he intervened. And that's how the whole carjacking, that's how he ended up getting beaten over the course of a carjacking, hence the nominal justification for mobilizing the National Guard into Washington, D.C. So I looked into that, and what I found is that that is the administration's version of the story. In the article I read about it anyway, they were citing administration sources who were saying that there was a woman getting carjacked and then Big Balls intervened and got his ass kicked. That's a fairly flattering portrayal, I assume. That is the tendency of the administration. They do prefer the most flattering possible interpretation of events. Digging more into the details, in other words, facts about the incident that did not come from the administration. Big Balls, I do not know his name. Big Balls is just too memorable. It kind of overshadows his actual name. He says that he was actually there with his girlfriend. So this was not just like some strange woman who happened to be getting carjacked, like in the proximity of his person. Presumably he was in the car or nearby when the carjacking happened. And thereupon he confronted perhaps the carjackers. I'm not sure. That much is not clear. I haven't read any details to that effect. But he was not just some like random dude intervening. He was just part of the carjacking and got beat for that reason. Near as I can tell, I welcome further corrections. Let's see. The other recent thing is Trump threatening to send the National Guard to Chicago. He's been making noise about that in some of his press conferences. He says that deploying the National Guard has significantly reduced crime in Washington, D.C., and that he should and his plans to do the same in other big cities that suffer from chronic problems with violent crime. Chicago in particular seems to be the one he emphasizes. So, of course, the mayor of Chicago came out and said he has no grounds to do that. Not that having no grounds to do something has really stopped him before. So this could happen hypothetically, but it would be illegal. The president can deploy the National Guard to Washington, D.C. He technically does have the authority to do that if he declares an emergency, which is what's happened. But the requirements to deploy the National Guard to a specific city in an actual state, not a province like District of Columbia, which is directly controlled by the federal government, that's very different. Legally speaking, the bar is much higher there, and I don't think they can clear it legally. So probably this is just more cheap talk, I would assume. But it is worth pointing out the institutional rot that this signifies. The president should not be threatening to invade this, that, or the other American city. This would have been considered something you would only see as satire in a movie if it happened. Well, it would not have happened 10 years ago, but if you suggested it might happen, it would have been considered outrageous. It's the kind of thing you would have only seen in a satire 10 years ago. But now it's actually happening, and I don't think anybody really knows entirely what to do with it. Like, do you even take it seriously? Because there is just so much cheap talk from the administration. Like, this is probably in the same vein. But at the same time, you can't completely write it off. Like, you do have to kind of hedge your bets. Really, it's specifically because people will hedge their bets in a way that delegitimizes the government and potentially creates conflict in future that it's best just to avoid doing this in the first place. Pretty much every president in American history has implicitly understood that. Even if they think crime is out of control in Chicago, they would not suggest invading it so that they could somehow reduce it. Also, it's worth mentioning that crime is not really down in Washington, D.C. It's not really clear even what the National Guard is actually doing in D.C. at this point. I did read that the Secretary of Defense ordered the National Guardsmen deployed to carry their weapons, which they had not been doing before. That's another new development. But that's still not like a plan. Again, I haven't seen what they actually plan to do, practically speaking, to reduce crime in D.C. So the whole thing, I maintain, is still kayfabe. Until proven otherwise, I'm sticking by that.
I saw a clickbait headline that said that Trump is deploying National Guard to 19 different states, which just seemed very large scale to me, but I didn't really pursue that further.
I think you might be thinking of something else, because I think there was an article a few days ago that 19 states are going to deploy their National Guard to Washington, D.C.
Oh, I might have read that the wrong way then.
Yeah, the 19 number is what stuck out to me. If not for that, then yeah, I would think it was something else. But I did read that 19 states are going to participate in the emergency, quote unquote, in Washington, D.C. So I suspect that's what it was. And the latest thing is that the FBI raided John Bolton's house. Not clear why, but it's broadly being interpreted as political retribution for Bolton criticizing Trump and his administrations in the past. I would point out that Bolton is not one of the guys that went after Trump. He wasn't one of the guys that tried to get him sued for this, that, or the other. Trump has some high fantasies about how the justice system was supposedly weaponized against him. Bolton was not part of that. Like, whether you believe Trump in that regard or not, Bolton was not involved. Bolton is a guy that used to work for him, who he then fired because he disagreed with him, and Bolton then wrote a book about him that he didn't like. And now the new Trump administration is punishing him for it. I don't really see any other way to interpret that.
Bit of a silly question, but have you been following the recent South Park episodes?
No, but the White House sure seems to be. And the more they do, the more South Park is going to go after them.
Yeah.
You know, you would think. Sorry, go ahead.
I've just heard that they're bangers, and it's kind of like, I don't know, they're coming out swinging. The show's been around for a long time, but it's had periods where it's kind of status quo and there's not too much bite to it, but apparently they have good political satire of both the left and the right, so it feels pretty dank regardless of who's watching it. It's just funny to see a show that's a very politically pointed and aggressive and critical, but both left-leaning and right-leaning people enjoy it. I think that's really good production. I haven't seen it though, so
Yes.
I can't really speak to it.
Yeah, I think they were mostly lampooning ICE, if I remember correctly. Yeah, most celebrities, prominent people of all varieties, politicians in particular, have long since learned that you don't fight South Park. That's a losing battle if ever there was one. You know, if comedians in general come after you, just leave them alone. You're never going to look good trying to go after a comedian. The political left in the United States kind of learned that the hard way, right? Because part of the reason the broader cultural zeitgeist turned against the left during the Trump years and especially during the Biden years is a sense of overreach culturally. And when they went after comedians, they kind of lost that constituency. And that's a very charismatic group of people. And you really don't want to agitate charismatic people because they know how to mobilize people against you, which is exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a pet theory of mine. I don't think that's the only reason the country really turned on Democrats, but I think it's a factor. I really do. You know, Joe Rogan and other comedian podcasters probably did more in that regard than the Purdue University people, the Koch brothers, etc. Like, there's only so much you can do with money, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that's all you have, you can only pump money into think tanks and agitprop outfits to so much effect. The comedians, much more impactful. They know how to connect with people.
Yeah, they're
So
more
you,
self-interested as well. You're not commissioning something to be produced for a political agenda. It's just the voice of the people, so to speak. So they're going to be a lot more on the heartbeat of the population because that's kind of what their end product is meant to serve. They're trying to make the people laugh. They're not trying to make the politicians feel good about themselves. Quite to the contrary.
yeah, and they got targeted for a while. And you would think an administration that was partly elected on the momentum from the backlash to that would know better than to pick on comedians. But here we are, like they're going after South Park. Going after South Park is especially stupid, though, in this regard, because South Park is such an established institution unto itself. It's been around forever. Most people are at least aware of it. And even those who don't kind of know not to take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So South Park, I don't think, is going to get a lot of pushback for this. The Trump administration, meanwhile, almost certainly will, because that's just stupid. You're like, what are you going to do? Like, imagine if they actually went after them, like really went after, who is it? They signed a deal with somebody, the studio that they work with. Like, that would just be awful optics for everybody. I don't think even the MAGA crowd could get behind that, really.
Yeah. Well, like I said with and you mentioned South Park will take a stab at anybody. They don't really seem to care. And
Yeah.
whoever is in power, they want to take a stab at more. So they've basically built credibility and like fan base from people who are right leaning whenever South Park bashes the left. And then when South Park bashes the right, the left likes them. So it's one of those that they play both sides, so you can't really go after them from one side without making yourself out to be the villain, because then you're just the fun police. Because they're
Yeah.
going to talk shit about anybody. You're not special just because they're talking shit about you. I felt
Yeah,
like
and the more you,
the TV show The Boys did a pretty good job of that as well, where it has a little bit of critique of both the right and left at the same time, so it doesn't really feel like propaganda. Evil superheroes. Has Agent Smith been keeping up on the Bernie Sanders speeches that have been streamed that have been happening lately? If so, do you have any thoughts?
no, no, I haven't heard anything. I mean, he's always been pretty active on social media. I assume it's pretty much more of the same. Has he changed tone in some way that's notable?
The American people deserve better wages, cheaper housing. I don't know. I haven't been following it.
Yeah, I'd have to look.
I respect the amount of yelling that he does, you know? He's been yelling and working at it for years. Agree with him or not, but he yells. And that's part of why he's a people's champ for a lot of people who are left-leaning.
I have a YouTube recommendation for you.
What's that?
So there's a YouTube channel called Extra History. They've been doing history content for a long time. I don't watch them as much as I probably should. But they did a really good series a long time ago on a medieval Indonesian kingdom. And the first episode was called Kingdom of Majapahit, an Empire of Water, Part 1. So if you're interested in learning more about medieval Indonesian history, which I know sounds esoteric, but it's actually really interesting, definitely give that a try.
Can you link that to me on Discord?
Yeah, I can send that to you.
I'll post it in the Twitch chat as well.
Oh shit, that's apologies to Mass Neotech.
He gets a recommendation too. What a bonus.
There we go. That's the right channel.
Cool. Posting that in Twitch chat. And then if I remember, I'll put it on in the YouTube comments, but if I forget, it's Majapahit. Majapahit, an empire of water, on Extra History. Thank you. Yeah, I like when there's a longer form historical piece. I remember we watched I think it's called The Story of India. It's a BBC publication. It was like, I don't know how many hours, like 4 hours or 6 hours or something. That's really good because you can dig into the broader history, which gives you a better sense of the culture. That kind of points to the comment you were making about the ideal government for a people is one that's going to stick for the cultural sentiment of the people. So if you have a longer form documentary, you get more of that context, which can inform like what their policies might end up being because of their history. It's all kind of connected. Well, cool. Well, I think that might be a good point to wrap us up. If that works with you.
Fair enough. Works with me.
Well, cool. Well, chat, thank you for your participation. Agent Smith for your time. Neuro for handling questions this time. And we'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.